necessarily appropriate for working from home or for homeschooling, that don't have the necessary facilities. And this in turn has again undoubtedly fed into an increase in domestic violence and child abuse that we're seeing growing data around from various different jurisdictions. I was reading today about Ireland. There's very serious concerns about domestic violence there. In the UK, there's an inquiry has just been set up to deal with increased child abuse as a result of COVID in this national context. A huge, again, building on existing shortcomings in mental health care provision in many countries, we're seeing huge mental health impacts due to lockdown conditions, both new problems experienced by people who haven't previously had mental health conditions, and of course those who have been with pre-existing mental health issues who have been very severely impacted by lockdown conditions and social isolation. We see the direct health impacts of COVID-19, pretty foreseeable, and they've been all over the headlines. But of course, what we're also seeing, and what we see UNICEF, the UN, WHO talking about, is the indirect and longer term health impacts due to, say, the cancellation or the suspension or defunding of non-COVID related treatments and care. And this is again going to be a very long-term legacy of COVID, particularly if economic crises result in cuts to health budgets beyond the COVID front line, as it were. I think the key thing to focus on at this point, though, and I know that this will tie in with the work of equality and human rights bodies, is that COVID hasn't hit everyone equally, right? It hasn't had an even impact across society. Just as we saw with the financial and economic crises in the late 2000s, we see that COVID is having a disproportionate impact on groups that were already badly off, already socially vulnerable. So older people, disabled people, migrants, refugees, ethnic and other minorities, people in care, all of these groups have been, and Roma, of course, in Europe, have been particularly hard hit by COVID, but also by state responses to COVID. Okay. Very important. It's not just the illness itself, it's the responses that have been taken in the context of this public health crisis. And obviously, when we turn to the social charter, we can see that there are a very wide range of charter provisions that are relevant to COVID. And I'm not going to, you will have the slides and you have copies of the charter. You don't need me to go through with this, but I've just talked about housing, food, poverty, work issues, and the particular position of socially vulnerable groups. And then you look at the charter and you see the right to protection of health, on which the European Committee has already issued a statement of interpretation. You have the right to health and safety work conditions, right to safe and healthy work conditions, a huge issue when we think about the reopening of schools, the rights of children and young persons to special protection, rights of disabled persons to independent social integration and participation in the community. Shielding hasn't gone away, and this right is, under ongoing pressure. Even though for many of us, lockdown is now a thing of the past, this is not true and will not be true for many people who are with disabilities or health conditions. Housing, all of these rights have been affected in some way or another by COVID. I think it's very important to note as well is that the European Social Charter system is often regarded as being quite complicated and challenging, etc., etc. But what's important to note is actually all Council of Europe countries have signed up to a range of these different rights. Okay, so they will all, it is absolutely valid to assess the measures taken by Council of Europe states. All states parties to the Social Charter, excuse me, not all Council of Europe parties, but all of the states parties to the European Social Charter are bound by some of these provisions. So where are we? And I'll come back again about those provisions and about the different state responses. Very importantly, this hasn't come out from nowhere, right? This isn't the first crisis in living memory. The financial and economic crises, 2007 and 2008, they kicked off. We're still living with their ongoing impacts. Made very clear the challenge faced by crises and state responses for human rights. Okay, we have the vocabulary. We have the conceptual understanding of the connection between human rights and particularly economic policy changes taken in a crisis context. And this is really largely as a result of a very sharp upskilling on human rights and economic policy work amongst NGOs, academics, NHRIs, equality institutions, and international human rights bodies. Okay, both the European Committee of Social Rights and a bit more belatedly, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights directly engage with this connection, this relationship between economic policy, often presented in the context of economic recovery, and human rights. We have the standards that we can use to assess states with, and these can be adapted to the COVID-19 situation. We've already seen this happen in a number of instances. And very positively, a final important positive, is the fact that the crisis led to a much broader awareness of social rights in Europe. And that this fed into the work of NHRIs and advocacy. And indeed, we see social rights being talked about in social and political discourse far more than we did before those crises. Okay? And indeed, we see it feeding into EU responses such as the social rights pillar, which the next speaker will address. So we should be in a good position, right? But of course, we're not. We might be in a better position than we would have been if we hadn't had the financial and economic crises, but we are not in a good position. First of all, we see when we talk about economic recovery, this ongoing resistance to human rights, and particularly social rights, because of perceptions of their resource demanding nature on the part of key national and supranational economists, from the IMF to central banks, to Treasury civil servants, to local authority decision makers dealing with budgets. There is not an openness, there is not a positive attitude towards human rights in terms of decision making across Europe. We're still seeing, very importantly, when we think about how we design when we think about the strong supranational element of the response to COVID, it is very significant that we still have a historic and ongoing marginalization of social rights in things like the European semester and the work of key EU institutions and actors focused specifically on economic policy. And I know, again, the next speaker, Katharina, will speak about the European Pillar of Social Rights, and it will be interesting to hear about how that ties in with those other actors working on issues that, of course, have huge impacts for social rights enjoyment through economic policy making. We have, and I mean, having slated the EU, I think it's important to note that the Council of Europe system certainly can't cover itself in glory, When we think about the focus of the Council of Europe, we think about wonderful work around torture, the work of the European Court of Human Rights. We think about a huge emphasis on civil and political rights. But the fact is that the work around social rights has not received the attention or the resourcing it needs at a Council of Europe level for it to come anywhere close to the profile of the work being done on civil and political rights. And I'd be delighted to talk about that further. I'm not just talking about my own committee, I'm talking very much about the mainstreaming of social rights in the works of other non-social rights specific bodies. So we have a situation effectively where we have very limited input of social rights into the recovery or the response to COVID so far. So what do we need? Well, we have a framework. And I think it's very important that when we do this work, and it's a real strength of social rights, is that we have to remember that we're not talking about human rights as things that can be used in courts to reactively punish the state, right? In this context of economic recovery, the key thing is that the Charter, a European specific, detailed, legally binding instrument, would be used as a framework for the proactive design, implementation and monitoring of law, policy and budget making. It's not about the courts, it's about the bodies that make law. It's about the bodies that make policy. It's about the bodies that determine expenditure. And we need tools for this. We need to integrate tools that integrate Charter rights into law, policy and budget decision making, both at the national and the supranational level, right? So to support states, to help them. And we need tools to develop data and to present alternative recovery models, economic recovery models, for instance, to serve as the basis of challenges or alternatives to economic choices that are not consistent with charter rights enjoyment. Okay, so that's very much, it's not just about supporting states, it's about reviewing states and holding them accountable for meeting the human rights obligations under the charter that they have signed up to. I'm going to very quickly, I'm conscious of time and we can come back to this, but one of the key tools, and I know that ENHRI is very interested in this, is the question of the guiding principles on human rights impact assessment of economic policy reforms. And I flag this because ENHRI is aware of it, but also because the guiding principles come at the end of a really long process of consultation and engagement and building upon the work done by a huge number of advocates, academics, UN experts, OHCHR, Council of Europe actors, focused on trying to integrate human rights from the get-go into economic and other policy making. Okay, and so I have given you a link to the guiding principles, and many of you will have read them. The key thing is that it's an ongoing process, right? The guiding principles require an ex ante and an ex post human rights impact assessment at regular intervals of economic policy, of economic reforms, right? And that's to do first of all, to assess what might happen with proposed policy changes and to try to mitigate rights damaging action there at that stage. And the ex post human rights impact assessment is to ensure that we can see the actual impacts of policy change and implementation in order to address such impacts. So to be carried out, who carries them out? If you look at the guiding principles, there's a huge amount of discretion given to states. It's recognized that states have a lot of discretion in terms of who would do the work. So you have national human rights institutions. The Scottish Human Rights Commission has done enormous work on this. You have NGOs who are already doing fantastic work in different contexts. You see much less of the state doing it. And I think it's important that when NHRIs and equality bodies engage in this work, that actually they are in effect working to help capacity build state actors who need to be doing this work if it's really going to be put in place from the very beginning. And I know that there are people on this call like Ali Hosey from the Scottish Human Rights Commission and people from IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, who will have both views on this. Quick comment. The guiding principles were designed with international human rights law in mind, but they draw very much on the UN standards, but they can absolutely be refocused for employment with the Charter. Okay, it's a methodology. The obligations, the human rights obligations or the human rights framework can be what you choose it to be, but the methodology is what is important. I'm going to finish now. I want to finish by saying, what is my committee going to be doing about COVID-19 using the Charter? Well, first of all, we have a statement of interpretation on the right to protection of health, and we're doing a much broader one, a statement of interpretation, which is the equivalent of, it's an authoritative interpretation, it's the equivalent of a general comment, so not a press release, not a statement, an authoritative interpretation of COVID-19 in and the relationship with the Charter. Okay, so that will be significant guidance to states, significant guidance to NHRIs and equality institutions. It'll be out later this year. Very importantly, we're going to next year, so in about 9 months, we will be opening our request for input from NHRIs about state achievements when it comes to health, social security, and social protection as part of our reporting system. And much of this work will focus on the period before COVID. But given that what we're seeing with COVID really reflects long-standing systemic shortcomings, NHRI input is crucial for this. We really, really need it. Finally, collective complaints. I can say no more, but I would be amazed, given that we were the first body to deal with the economic and financial crises complaints long before other international bodies were doing it. I would be amazed if we didn't have a COVID-related one very soon. But I'll leave it there. There's some information on the other slides about how you can engage with us and more information. But the crucial question really is at this point, what are you going to do about the Charter on COVID? I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Eva. Very interesting. I hope the others enjoyed also all the information provided, especially what the committee is going to do in the coming weeks and months, and what you have already started. So I now give the floor to Katharina to continue with the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is another interesting topic for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And well, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. It would be even better if we could see each other in person, but I guess this virtual reality is making us take new patterns, not only on the way that we work, but also that we see the world. And I think if continuing in the light of my previous speaker, the question is, what is Commission going to do in terms of social policy and social rights in the future? And I'll try to give you few replies, and I'll try to give you overview of some of, let's say, the highlights where we are going and where we are heading. First of all, I want to demystify one thing, and I want to say that if we take a look on the European semester and the process of having the social, let's say, social CSRs, we see not huge, but an amazing increase in numbers of social rights related country-specific recommendations from the time that European Pillar of Social Rights was accepted and adopted and proclaimed in Gothenburg. So it's 2017, and the first reflection was already visible in 2018 when we did the first country reports and the CSRs based on the European Pillar of Social Rights. And I think if we take from there, from 2018, around 40% of the CSR are of some kind of social nature. And if you really compare it with the time before the pillar, then I think the difference is really visible, and it's important to highlight it. And it's important also to be fully aware what did the pillar bring to us. Okay, but let me go back to what I wanted to share with you. I think that unfortunately, the COVID crisis is going to leave us with a huge challenges. I don't think that this is just another crisis, and I think we are going to see quite soon how serious this crisis was and how seriously did it affect all areas of our societies. And just another day, there was a summer package, summer forecast, where we see that the serious deterioration of economic and social situation is going to be visible much more than we expected. The average decline of the GDP is expected around 8%. And the average unemployment rate would unfortunately increase what was 6.7 in 2019 to almost 9% in 2020, and it's further going to well, still to be seen what will happen in 2021, but the rebound is also expected to go way slower, and the data are really not in our favor in any area of actions that we are dealing with. Also, we have seen as never before how the COVID crisis has put more pressure on the capacity of public policies, including the employment and social policies. And also the pressure was to ensure cohesion and really to address poverty and inequalities. And this is this can be said in all senses of addressing inequalities and addressing poverty challenges. I think that official statistics will only reveal the full extent of the ongoing trends much later. And some of the forecasts say clearly that we can expect the decrease in household incomes. And of course, then it will be closely linked with the poverty and exclusion. So when we say, and when we take a look on our pillar, European Pillar of Social Rights, and its 20 principles, which indeed represent, I think, our own common values that we as the Europeans share, we see more than ever need to guide our economic and social policies by the pillar principles. Further, it is not just the economic strain, but the increased burden that is faced by some compared to the others, and we also have to address it. And for example, women who have been, I would even dare to say, heroes of the families in having to adjust to working and supporting children or family in need of care while holding down a job. We see that they are overrepresented on front lines and still underpaid compared to their male counterparts. The same experience goes for the migrants and the third country nationals, who indeed have suffered way disproportionately and at the hands of virus due to poorer conditions and increased representation in the care industry. We also see that children have really had a tough time in really accessing and adapting to the new learning methods. We saw in almost all of our member states that many children from disadvantaged families were lacking the means or the necessary equipment to connect remotely and to continue their education. And also what we saw is that persons with disabilities were also put at a greater risks. And I don't think that we even need to remind all of us today how our elderly population suffered in the time of crisis and what the challenges were in this respect. So what did we do? What did EU do in let's say last 4 months? I think first of all, we did a fast regrouping and seeing how we can be supportful and how we can help. So with, I would say, unprecedented firepower and flexibility, we did our response packages, the CRI and CRI Plus, Coronavirus Response Initiative, and the second version of such an initiative that was adopted immediately in March and April following the crisis, showed that we managed to get on board all the funds to secure the fast reallocation between the different funds, because many member states have used some of the funds, and usually the ESF was largely already contracted and in implementation, while there were plenty leftovers maybe in some other funds, and we secured that this transition from fund to fund could be much faster. We increased also the co-financing rate, and we also introduced some areas where this flexibility should be further promoted in order to address immediate challenges. You probably know, and especially those of you who are dealing with in any way with EU funding, that the eligibility period that we had put in those actions is the 1st of February. So indeed, retroactive implementation is something that we so welcome in this case. But this was also laying the foundations for the recovery package published on the 27th May, which is our major, let's say, recovery plan package, including the multi-annual financial framework and all different aspects how to address post-crisis and post-COVID time. And still we have to see, unfortunately, what will the autumn bring. Regarding the pillar, let me just tell you that the pillar with its principles, and many of you know, we have been called upon various stakeholders to come up with an action plan. And yes, the action plan is in the Commission work program. It is also part of all the political guidelines of the President, commissioners, and it is going to become a reality. The pillar action plan is planned to be adopted early next year. We are pretty sure that it will be before the end of Q1. And the pillar action plan is going to say which actions are going to be undertaken within each pillar principle. Also, we always say that pillar is not only for the EU in general, not meaning the EU institutions, but pillar is, as it was proclaimed by the member states and the Council and the Parliament, pillar is our common tool, and still it is to be seen how these stakeholders, but also civil society and the social partners are going to be taken on board when defining the pillars, implementation and the monitoring. And by that, for us in the Commission, all of the stakeholders are equally important. For us, it is important to continue the social dialogue, to include the civil society as much as possible in both in the implementation. And when I say implementation, I don't only mean the implementation at the EU level, but at the national level, and also within the member states, local and regional sometimes play such an important role. Just look at childcare or education, where majority of the actions is undertaken on that level. So this is something to have in mind. We also have already announced several initiatives within the pillar, but that are going to see the day of a light soon. We already have some initiatives being accepted, adopted at the Commission level. Last week, we saw a birth of our YES package, the new and reinforced youth guarantee, and vocational education and training recommendations, along with the new skills agenda communication. So this is something that we will be discussing now in a trialogues, in a communication, not a trialogue, but a communication with the member states. And also, you are all aware, especially our social partners, on the developments related to the minimum wages and the second stage consultations that are ongoing. Or just to mention briefly that we will be working a lot in eradicating poverty. We see the poverty as the biggest challenge and the biggest issue in addressing inequalities, or increasing inequalities in the society if we don't address it properly. We don't see that there is one type of action that should address the poverty. We see it as a number and numerous actions, such as our child guarantee, but also we see the further initiatives in the area of minimum income that will help to reduce the poverty. And we also see the comprehensive approach that requires not only the funding, the means, such as benefits, but also includes all various range of other instruments, such as active inclusion measures, especially in the area of employment, and improving services as well. So this would be, let's say, I already am late for for another meeting, but nevertheless, I hope you grasp the idea of where we are going. I did not touch upon the housing this time and housing exclusion and homelessness, where we also plan to have a much more active role. I did not speak about long-term care that would require huge reflection, especially in the light of the COVID and how our member states reacted and what was done well and less well. And this is why I say this is not just another crisis. It shows that no matter that what we faced in 2008, we were not prepared, and we were not prepared, and our contingency planning was really, I would dare to say, challenging, if non-existent in some places. And this also shows where we need to work. And then also another challenge put in front of the health systems, where we saw a huge lack of workforce, where we saw the need of different involvement of different stakeholders, community-based services, especially in the light of persons with disabilities and persons with health problems, but that could be addressed at home if such a services existed. Then also the impact of the confinement on those services. And so now I could really go on and go on, but I hope you grasp the idea of where we are going from now. And I'm really sorry that I can't be with you, but because I'm sure that the discussion is really going to be great. So looking forward to see the conclusions, and just to congratulate you, Henri, for continuing your good work even in this awful confinement, and truly hoping that maybe next time, or if not next time, the following one, we meet in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina. It was extremely interesting. May I just ask one question before you go?
Sure, absolutely.
I'm personally interested to know about the action plan on the implementation of the pillar. If I well understood, so there will be different actions under each principle. How these different actions have been identified, where did you gather it, and how information did you, for example, refer to only to the country, to reports received from the countries, or did you use also other resources from other international organizations? Or how was this?
Well, we use all the different sources, but before the COVID, we planned starting in March to the capitals with our commissioner, who would then have a dedicated sessions with the different stakeholders. So the government officials, the local level providers, then civil society representatives. Also, in each city, we plan to have the hearing with the social partners, but as you know, this had to be postponed. Commissioner Schmidt started recently the virtual tour. He was already in Zagreb, he was already in Budapest, and he was, I think, in Tallinn. And he's continuing the tour, the capitals. You can follow that on our website. There is a list of, and it's easy accessible. I was listening to the last one that we had in Hungary. It was very good. It was surprisingly well done and well organized. It lasted, instead of an hour and a half, 3.5 hours, and commissioner was there the whole time. So imagine the mess in his cabinet when they had to postpone and reschedule the rest of his day. So it's not really as good as it would be that we are in person, but it's at least that what we can do in circumstances like this. We have also open consultations on the pillar. You can, if you Google "have your say on European Pillar of Social Rights," then you can get there, where we have the open consultation process for until the 30th of November. So there is still plenty of time. And then for different initiatives, we have dedicated sessions. Last week, we started meeting the stakeholders for the new disability strategy. So in the area of disability, which is one of the pillar principles, We started also with some with consultations for the child guarantee. Our colleagues from the social partners know well that you discuss a lot about the minimum wage, and this is indeed at the hands of, I would dare to say, the social partners. We also had various meetings with the stakeholders relevant to the housing and housing exclusion, and also but these are targeted actions. But we also, when the action plan will be, let's say, in a more developed phase, we also plan another round of consultation before its adoption. So it is within, of course, the given time frame. But I think there are indeed really plenty of opportunities. What we can do, maybe if you are in ENNHRI interested in discussing specifically the pillar, we can maybe organize sometimes in autumn, let's say early October, a dedicated session only about pillar, and maybe the different role that different stakeholders have, let's say, in implementation and in monitoring of the pillar. So I think that would be very interesting for you and your interlocutors. So really free and open to your advices and ideas.
Okay, thank you. Oh, well, I'm from the European Social Charter, so I'm more interested in how the European Social Charter can be used and be of help, and the findings of the committee to build on this action plan. So, but thank you. It was very interesting. So we'll have a look at the virtual meetings. So now, thank you very much, Eva and Katarina, and I will goodbye. So all the best. And thank you for being with us. I will pass the floor now to Mila, who's going to take care of the panelists.
Thank you, Tanya. Unfortunately, I could not catch Ms. Ivankovic-Knežević, just to thank her and to for this offered opportunity, and to...
My fault, sorry.
It's okay. I just wanted to confirm on behalf of at least Equinet, but I'm sure maybe our counterparts, national human rights institutions, would also be interested in attending such a targeted consultation session on measures for implementing the social pillar. So we would definitely, if I have the agreement of the partners, Council of Europe, FRA, ENNHRI, we should aim for organizing such an initiative. Thank you, Tanya. And then maybe I would now give a couple of minutes if you have questions to Eva. If I may refer to Ms. Nola informally with first name. Yeah. I would open the floor for questions. You can write once again in the chat directly. You can use the Q&A chat box, or you can raise your hand, and with my co-moderator and friend Nina, we would make sure your question is conveyed.
Yeah, I'm looking.
No?
If yeah, I don't see any hands. I don't see anybody putting into chat, and I don't see any Q&A being filled. So I don't know if the participants are just interested to hear more.
I mean, I'm staying for the whole thing, so it's easier to address questions once there's more to think about. You know, I'll be here, so don't.
All right.
Have me until I pick up my children.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this. Then we move on to the moderated discussion. I would ask Nina, if possible, maybe to put a slide with the panelists. So we would have a discussion addressing a range of questions on the risks and challenges of COVID-19 and what does an equality and human rights approach to recovery look like? What are the necessary elements, components? What tools do we have at our disposals? How can we better adapt existing tools or maybe create new ones? Some of those questions were already raised by Eva. In general, how do we address what Eva has aptly called the marginalization of social rights? Because this is one of the underlying problems that all of you as national human rights institution and equality body representatives face in your works. We have a panel of distinguished speakers. We have a representative of the European Agency of Fundamental Rights, our partner. This would be Grigorios Tsoukas, and I apologize in advance if I am inadvertently mispronouncing some of the names. We have Sandra Konstantsky, who is the director of the Austrian Ombud for Equal Treatment. We are happy to have Mr. Michael Windflow, a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and also a member of the German Institute for Human Rights. We are happy to have Kim van Sparentak on board. She's a member of the European Parliament from the Greens and IFA group. And last but definitely not least, we are honored to have Mr. Stefan Klovert. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, who represents the European Trade Union Confederation and works with the European European Committee of Social Rights regularly. So the first question that I would like to pose to you concerns the specific risks and challenges that are, I'm sorry, may I ask, I think there is an echo, if I could ask somebody to, if possible, mute. Yeah, I think it disappeared. So what are the specific risks and challenges that were highlighted and exacerbated as a result of the COVID-19 crisis? Or to put it simply, what are the challenges you have seen at national level, but also in your experience at the European level, if applicable? Perhaps Grigorios could start the round. Is this fine with you, Grigorios?
Yes, it is fine. I don't know if somebody else would like to start, if they have any other engagements. So if not, yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, of course, I will thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank everybody who is attending this meeting. Of course, I will talk about the work that FRA has been doing during these last months. Maybe you are aware that as of April, FRA has started publishing a series of monthly bulletins trying to identify what are the main challenges with respect to fundamental rights during the COVID crisis. Until now, we have published three such bulletins. And the last one was on the 30th of June. And now we are preparing the fourth to be published end of July. And at the same time, we will have a particular report bulletin coming out focusing on the situation of Roma across the EU. I don't have any date for the Roma bulletin, but should be out also soon. Now, in our last bulletin, the one published in June, there is also a focus section on the situation of older people that were hit hard during the crisis. But I will come to this later. So these bulletins are based on information that FRA collected through our network of national experts across the EU. Online, we can find not only the FRA bulletins, but also the country studies that are supporting these bulletins. In these country studies, and I would recommend, if people are interested in this, to see this evidence, to also consult the country studies, because the wealth of the information is there. The bulletins have to be concise, so we just try to summarize the main findings in these bulletins. What are the main challenges now that we have identified with respect to human rights? Of course, the bulletins cover a broad range of rights, also on discrimination, and how people access justice during the crisis, implication on data protection with the application, all these tracing applications. But here I will focus more on the impact on social rights, of course. First of all, it has already been mentioned. I mean, obviously, the first challenge is how to ensure the right to health and the right to preventive care and medical treatment, both components of this right. This was the case particularly for people having underlying health conditions, especially those in old age. I don't put all people in old age in this category, but especially those having underlying health conditions. Well, the obvious finding is that many health systems were unprepared to deal with this situation. It was admitted before also. Katerina, I think, highlighted it. And this unpreparedness actually was one of the main reasons that led also to the general lockdown for the whole population and the general lockdown of society and economy, with all the impact that this had to all kind of rights. So this situation points to the importance of having well-functioning public health systems, ensuring affordable access to health services to all. So this would be my first point. The second point is relevant to social security, social protection, and social assistance. It was also raised before. This situation had a huge impact, huge consequences on employment and the labor market, affecting particularly those, everybody, but particularly those who are most vulnerable in the labor market. And this was the case with women, this was the case with single parent families, this was the case with migrant workers, and of course with Roma. And particularly affected were also people who are self-employed, people who work in the so-called gig workers. A big number of workers in the area of hospitality and tourism face layoffs and unemployment. And this is obvious in countries that rely a lot, their economies rely a lot on tourism. This is the case in Italy, this is the case in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal. Governments had to take extraordinary measures to mitigate the impact on workers and their families, supplementing wages, offering financial support to companies to keep their workers in work, providing unemployment benefits and other special allowances to workers and self-employed. But the big question is what happens next? I mean, Katerina mentioned that actually the forecast is really very disappointing with respect to growth and to unemployment. A third issue that I would like to spot is to raise is the right to education, and what was the impact and how children especially were affected by the closing of schools. By late March, all countries closed their schools, and schools never went back to regular functioning, even now, and nobody knows if and how they will reopen in September. This disruption has, of course, heavy consequences for the rights of the child and of children and their future development. Of course, in all countries, there were efforts to support learning, to promote distance learning. However, although I understand how important is distance learning, it cannot be a substitute for school and the educational process, social process. takes place in schools, especially for younger children. In addition, distance learning, of course, requires access to appropriate equipment and quality internet, digital skills for parents to help their children. I mean, whoever had the experience of, and I had this experience trying to help my children, you know, to keep up with distance learning, I realized that I needed first to learn, to develop new skills. It was not that obvious. This shouldn't be taken for granted. And the last point on older persons, they were hardly hit, especially those living in institutions. Of course, I assume that many lives were saved by the lockdown and the ban on visits and recommendations and orders to stay at home. However, many people still faced serious health issues. Many people died, and research and evidence shows also that this lockdown and all these measures had a terrible impact on their feelings of isolation, of psychological distress. I think that I will stop here. So all these elements that I raised are evidenced in these bulletins. And as I said, I insist that people who are interested should also consult the country studies where they can find a lot of information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grigorios. It was very informative. And as you aptly noted, in a sense, there is no back to normal, right? For example, no full-scale resumption of school activities, health situation totally changed. You also mentioned that new skills are needed, not only about education, but in general, digital skills. All of us need to now work and communicate online, which specifically impacts upon older persons, persons with disabilities, but in general, those who do not have the economic means to buy computers, to have this digital culture. Thank you for this. And if I may now give the floor to Kim, who has informed us that she needs to leave earlier. Kim, maybe perhaps you can say just a few words about you, since this is the first time when we have the pleasure of having you as a guest speaker.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to catch a train. But thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, I'm very happy already with the very interesting input we had before. So my name is Kim van Spartak. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA. And currently I am the rapporteur for the report on adequate and affordable housing, which is coming from the Social Affairs and Employment Committee, and I'm also a member of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee. So I think that when it comes especially to housing, we see that there is a discrepancy between the way that the European Union is approaching housing and the fact that actually housing is a fundamental right and is specifically mentioned like that. So what we're seeing is that we already had a huge housing crisis before COVID came. It's also the reason that the Employment Committee decided to put forward an own initiative report on housing as one of the first things for this mandate. Specifically because we see the huge impact that the affordability crisis has on people. We see that people can't afford the rent anymore. We see that there's an increase in energy poverty. We see that there's an increase, a doubling even, in homelessness. So you start from this housing crisis that we already had, and then you get the message, hey, there is a global pandemic, please shelter in place. There are so many people who already don't have a house. On top of that, you have a lot of people who are not sleeping rough, but are economically homeless. So they are sleeping, for example, at friends or at family. You have a lot of people who are living in houses that are way too small or not adequate, for example, to have a family in. And these people all have had a shelter in place. And this, I think, puts forward even more how much housing is a fundamental right, and we should really start treating it like that. But another thing we saw during the COVID crisis is that things were suddenly possible. Things were possible that were never possible. We could suddenly house homeless people. We could ban rent increases. We could ban evictions. We could finally protect people and making sure that they still had a roof over their head. So this is, I think, one of what we saw and also what we learned. It is possible. And of course, the aftermath, and it's already happening, is that, a lot of people will have higher indebtedness, and a lot of people are at the risk of being evicted right now. And especially when the economic crisis starts hitting even harder, this is going to be something that is, perhaps even unprecedented. So what can we do to make sure that that doesn't happen? Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we start finally actually treating having a roof over your head as a fundamental right. And if you base your policies on that, then you have to change a lot of things and the way that we are treating housing right now. The housing is a housing market right now. This means that, especially when we're talking with local stakeholders, we hear that the right for big investors to buy up housing and make a profit of that is, according to the rules and according to the law, a higher priority, and they have more rights to do that than actually making sure that people have a house, an affordable house to live in. So I think that is the whole shift that we have to make, and really changing that. But next to that, I think that very often housing and, for example, poverty are not seen as two sides of the same coin. And that's why I really hope that the things that Ms. Knežević said about eradicating poverty, enforcing the child guarantee, that within that homelessness is treated as extreme poverty, and that when we try to eradicate child poverty, the eradication of homelessness is also part of that. Where are we moving forward? That's also, of course, an important question in a bigger scale. And of course, we also have, especially when you're green, but we have, it is very important that we also look at the Green Deal and try to integrate that as well. And that's where I see a lot of opportunities with the Green New Deal, ensuring that we put the environment and the social rights of people at the core of what we do in the European Union. Because in the end, a climate crisis is going to affect everyone, and going to affect especially also the rights of everyone. So hopefully when we have a recovery fund, we will have the conditions that will make sure that we push forward towards a more social and green Europe, where fundamental rights are respected. And for that we need very clear conditions, but based on the environment and the social aspects. And within the Green New Deal, we really have to make sure that we don't just put funding to big corporations that say that they are going to greenwash their processes, but rather see how we can use the Green New Deal to elevate people from poverty and make sure that we not only create a climate neutral continent, but actually we create a more social and climate just continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. Inspiring indeed, making environment and social rights mutually reinforceable, and basing our economic and social policies on the presumption that social rights, including housing, are fundamental rights. This would really turn around the whole free market logic, which is currently prevailing. You gave us the European Parliament kind of regional perspective, and now I would like, if possible, to hear from Sandra, who is the director of the Austrian Ombud for Equal Treatment. Hopefully she can give us some insight on how these messages resonate with her at the national level, but also talk about some broader Equinet initiatives on equality and social justice. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Well, I was thinking of the first challenge that equality bodies had during this crisis, and I think it was counseling and supporting via home office victims of discrimination. So it was possible, but it was a challenge, I would say. But the more challenge that I want to come to is to really see that we as equality bodies, and also the Austrian equal treatment, Ombud for Equal Treatment, had to make the current discrimination visible, had to collect data, had to see the new phenomenons that comes in a new cloth, but is very old also, but comes in new faces. The Austrian Ombud tried to collect data with, or is already collecting data with COVID-19 impacts, and we also introduced, but we were a bit challenged from Equinet, where I will come to. So we introduced the equality block to show the present problems that came to us during this crisis, and make some stories visible. And I can really refer to what Aoife said and also Katrina, because what were the cases? I mean, we were talking about homeschooling, excluding children without the essential equipment like a laptop. And it made it difficult for pupils without German mother tongue to have homeschooling. So these were some kind of stories that came to us. Or we also had cases of women, they were admonished not to make use of childcare facilities and work from home and take care of the children. So this, well, you can also do both. You can work from home and take care of your children. And of course, we also tried to make equal pay visible, pay for equal value, making women's jobs, which were really, really essential, showing the little payment of women's jobs that were essential during the crisis. And that was always also the thing that Equinet made. I'm also board member of Equinet, and Equinet had really provided or provides now an online database on COVID-19 cases, and also a database on activities from national equality bodies across Europe. And also this database, and I also mentioned, I've already mentioned it, we as equality bodies have to make the current phenomenons really visible and show what happens now. And I want to just give a few messages that now in our online database is visible. So it was about that nearly 70% of Equinet's members report receiving complaints and handling related cases on the COVID-19 pandemic. And the grounds of discrimination, the most often grounds cited by the equality bodies related to COVID-19 was disability, followed by age. The third highest number of cases related to the COVID-19 crisis was related to racism and xenophobia, and we also had to see discrimination against Asian or Italian people, but also, and that's I think really current problem, is against Roma and travelers. So this discrimination includes the denial of goods and services, refusal to access to accommodation, and of course instances of hate speech online and in person. And the most Common perpetrators include individuals, private businesses, and local authorities. The other thing, and we also saw that in Austria, is a crisis of labor rights. We will have that more than now, but we will get to that. And we also have received, and national equality bodies all around Europe received many employment-related complaints, wrongful dismissals of pregnant women, of older people, where they have normally they have strong rights, and now the corona crisis make it possible to dismiss, or not possible, but it's a bit the easy, you know, wording to say it's because of the crisis. We often have employees being forced to use their annual leave for self-isolation or discriminatory treatment of employees with caring responsibilities, which I already mentioned. So I think this was really, these are the points, sorry. Another thing was, and we also got that in Austria, that vulnerable groups, there are more vulnerable groups that also related to equality bodies, namely the people with victims of domestic violence, homeless people, and people deprived of their liberty, such as prisoners and migrants. So I think what I already mentioned is that I think that equality bodies, and we also had, of course, some good practices. So the Dutch, no, sorry, I made it wrong now. Okay, that's what I wanted to say, because I'm really sorry that I also had to leave in 10 minutes. I told you that I have to leave at 4. But I think that's the most challenge for equality bodies, is to really make visible what the new phenomena are, and that they are, of course, old phenomena. So that we have to really look at it from a new face, but see that it's just, you know, a focus on the old inequalities that now comes with new challenges, and with the intersectional challenge of the socio-economic status. So I think that's the really main point of equality bodies, to make this visible, and to get this ground into the directives and into our law, and to get more possibilities to make it, to fight for these rights.
Thank you very much, Sandra. If I may, if Michael and Stefan agree, since I'm acutely aware of the fact that both Kim and Sandra need to leave in about 10 minutes, would it be okay with you, Michael and Stefan, if we now ask the participants to address their questions to Sandra and Kim at this stage, and then we would resume with your interventions. Would this be all right with you? Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I give the floor back to you, dear participants. And with the help of Nina, Sandra and Kim would receive your questions.
Sorry, yeah, hello. There's one question actually that we received from Philip from H Europe, which is actually dealing with all the persons' rights. I mean, you would see it if you open the Q&A icon, which should be normally on the bottom of your screen. And the question is, the enormous impact of the COVID-19 crisis on older persons, especially on older persons in long-term care, has shown to us that existing commitments, right to health, are far from being fulfilled. So what do you think, in your opinion, it can give more impetus for the discussion around all the persons' rights? And is there room for it at a level of Council of Europe, as the UN level discussions are ongoing? I mean, I'm just reading it loud. I don't know, like Kim, Sandra, I think you can also decide whether you would like to react to this question. But as I also see it, maybe it's a question for IFA or even Tanya as it relates to the Council of Europe. But I leave it up to you.
Maybe since Kim and Sandra have to leave shortly, maybe you can also address some of the points raised by the keynote speakers, by Katarina and IFA. For example,
I can give a little bit of a comment regarding the facilities where elderly people are living, and we see that the COVID crisis has really highlighted the way that these facilities are being built, and that such a pandemic like the COVID pandemic is very incompatible with the way that elderly facilities have been built. And we've already been in touch with quite some stakeholders who really see an urgency now to rethink the way that these kind of facilities are being built, and really use the renovation wave also as a tool to you know, at once make sure that it's more climate neutral, but also healthier housing, and in general healthy housing I think has become also more highlighted. So that's what I could answer in that regard.
I have to say that I completely agree, and I think we really feel what's the name for it? So we don't have the horizontal directive yet, have we? So, and that's the problem. I think we really feel the missing of this link to have a really whole architecture on equality in Europe. And like in Austria, well, we don't have leveled up our equal treatment law so we don't have this kind of protection for people. Also, perhaps protection with equal treatment law. So I think we have to fight to really get this horizontal directive and really make this protection umbrella, yeah, as a whole. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sandra. You also said those new old problems that we see with COVID, and this is something that IFA also said in her presentation, Back to the Future. We are seeing old familiar violations of social rights in times of crisis reappearing, perhaps under a new guise, perhaps in exacerbated form. But back to the question that was asked by Age Platform Europe, if I could give the word to Eva to answer it, if possible.
Very quickly, just a straight yes answer. I think it's had a huge impetus to older persons' rights. I think at the UN level, you're going to see major steps forward in terms of a potential treaty on older persons' rights. You're going to see a lot of UN treaty bodies and indeed the European Committee and other regional bodies issuing statements on older people's rights, which they've mentioned. And the UN Committee is unusual in having a general comment focused specifically on the area. But I think you're going to see much more integration of older people as a group into human rights language and outputs from human rights bodies. I also think at a domestic level, it's been such a huge issue that you're going to see far more ombudspersons at a national level, and you're going to see NHRI and equality institutions hugely responding to this work, because I think the focus has been on older people. And while a lot of these issues are systemic, one of the challenges with older people is we don't really have the tools, the human rights language or tools, or certainly it's not as developed as it is for other groups to challenge what has happened in the context of COVID. And we need to build our capacity there and ensure that those who are at risk have the protection they need and the attention they need from the international and national bodies responsible for ensuring that human rights are covered.
Thank you, Aoife. I suggest that we leave or temporarily park the question of other persons' rights here, and we resume with answering the question on risks and challenges. And since you brought up helpfully also international instruments for the protection of other persons, and we do have this ongoing discussion at the UN level, the UN Open-Ended Group on Aging, I would now give the floor to our UN representative, though from a different context. It's our treaty body. I call it our, as it's on economic, social, and cultural rights. This would be Mr. Michael. I'm sorry, Michael. I'm not sure I am able to. Windvoer. I think that's how I pronounce your name.
Yeah, it's Windvoer.
Yeah, Windvoer. And Michael would also represents the German Institute for Human Rights. So Michael, if you could briefly, 3 to 5 minutes, give us some highlights or sketch your response to what are the risks and challenges that COVID. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I'm sorry, I'm sitting on the campsite in Denmark. And it might be a bit sound in the air because I can't avoid having some noise surrounding me. I wanted to speak first maybe on the perspective of a German Institute for Human Rights and national human rights institutions, and maybe in a second round I can answer more systematically questions from the committee's perspective. Yeah, maybe that helps me a bit to be focused. Yeah, concerning the German situation, I would say 6 thoughts. First, I want to say we have a differentiated impact even in a well-developed welfare state in Germany. Yeah? We have a very good response from our government to, let's say, the formal sector of employment. We have these short-term work allowances. More than 8 million people are getting this. It might be prolonged up to 2 years, 24 months. So these more than 8 million people are covered more or less quite well. We have a okay response to social security. Some new inventions has been made, like extra money for people who have kids, or the payment for people who can't afford their rents is taken over for half a year, and also the cost for heating. There is also some easier access for self-employed to the social security system. So things has been improved there, but many poverty pockets has been overseen yet. Yeah. And then we have a very difficult situation for all those who are in an informal sector, you can say, yeah, which is at least 5% of the workforce. Yeah, that's people working in home care. Many people from Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, who are taking care of elderly in our situation. Agricultural laborer. We have workers in tourism, in bars. We have a lot of other situations where we have informal work. Yeah, we have a huge percentage of self-employed people, maybe 5% of the labor force, which is not protected by formal contracts, which has been promoted by neoliberal policies in the last years and now left over. So there's very different responses. Then the second argument is we have the COVID crisis like a burning glass on old problems, which we have. Yeah. Like the situation in refugee homes was bad in beforehand. It's now even bad, worse even under COVID. Yeah, we have situation in care centers for elderly, which is particularly difficult in many areas, but now has become very difficult. We have heard about the psychological problems. We have the bad payment for essential jobs, as it is often called, those working in hospitals, in care, in supermarket cashiers, who are now confronted with the COVID crisis particularly. We have the situation on children, we talked about this in school closures, violence at home, we have many poverty pockets and homelessness. So all these groups, problems which has been there, has been now in a way modeled even more visible and need a specific response. If I would summarize how Germany has responded, it was a bit like a learning by doing. When one group was making a demonstration, then the government identified, oh, this group also needs certain help. Yeah, so they started with a big business, and then they later had some formal employers. Then later they identified maybe those working with elderly needs also some support. But there was never something like what we call the human rights impact assessment at the beginning. Yeah, really checking what are the vulnerable groups and who should get the attention. It was a step-by-step approach. Some groups has been overseen up to now, and others has been maybe got some support. Yeah, and while we are using a huge amount of money for this without a human rights impact assessment, we are afraid that much money will be missing at the end to deal with those who are really at stake, yeah, who are really poor, yeah, while a lot of money is spent on other purposes. So there is no, let's say, reasonableness test made yet for the money spent, yeah, or the proportionality of the money which goes where. And in that sense, human rights impact assessment at the beginning would have been very helpful in order to digest maybe where we put the money, yeah, where we put the resources, the political attention to, and this is the way missing. So the response sometimes is not bad because it's learning by doing, but it's not systematic, it's not looking into the particularly vulnerable groups, and I think that is the core of the problem which we see. I would like to add 3 short thinking. The German Institute for Human Rights, we made the first response to the COVID very early at the beginning, showing which groups might be overseen. We later published then specific, let's say, dossiers on the situation of elderly, on children, and on people with disabilities. I think these are important steps which shows what national human rights institutions can do, highlighting maybe groups which are traditionally overseen. I have to say, we also have to learn a lot about economic, social, cultural rights. We are working also a bit more with civil and political rights, like most other national human rights institutions. Yeah, and it was often social welfare organizations, the Anti-Poverty Network and others who were much more louder expressing the needs of people overseen. Yeah, so that is something I think we as a movement, anti-discrimination movement, but also national human rights institutions, we have to learn to be really, in a way, able to have a systematic approach to economic, social, cultural rights is also on our task, learning more and being more sharp in our analysis. The 5th point I want to make is at the European level, we also have to discuss this. It took a long discussion in Germany in the last weeks. Maybe can we give some support to other European countries without maybe too much ties, having an untied support package or a support package which can be decided by countries itself. These type of debates are also part of our answers to the crisis. Yeah, we have to give European institutions and also the money we're giving a certain autonomy, yeah, untied aid, as it was called very much in developing aid in the 70s and 80s. That's what often needed from countries like Italy and Spain. And we have to win these situations and we have to learn from old mistakes. For example, why we have so many hospital places available in Germany, because we had not to follow austerity measures. Yeah, we still have a lot of hospitals in rural areas. We had always the discussion in Germany, we should get rid of all these hospitals to be more efficient, but we have not done it because we had no external pressure. And we had less pressure on privatization of hospitals. So some things has been different in Germany because we didn't have any austerity pressure like Greece or Spain or France even had. And I think that is something to learn. And there are now debates even in health economists in Germany that probably we were not so efficient in getting rid of all these hospitals were helping us in the cure of patients, yeah, because we were much more equipped to do so. So this needs to be reflected when we come to a European level perspective. Maybe the last point I want to mention, because we have just not talked about this, is also the international response. We tend to focus on COVID only in our own countries or maybe at the European level. Take, for example, the textile industry in Bangladesh or Vietnam or Ethiopia. All the big labels has cancelled all their contracts. And from one day of another, we have well elaborated supply chains, value chains, but they stopped buying all the textiles they have ordered. Yeah, they even have not said anything how they want to order in future. Yeah? So many people are also being affected by our own policies internationally without having thought about this. So this is also one, at least, level of social response we have to keep in mind, because we have all benefited a lot from very well developed, let's say, long distance supply chains. But when it comes then to the, let's say, point of a crisis, we just stop it and let Bangladesh and Vietnam and Ethiopia alone with the situation. Yeah, so we have to have a better understanding on these situations. Maybe this is in a nutshell the points I want to make from the German perspective, and maybe in the second round I can talk more about from the committee's perspective. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very, well, for me, inspiring insight, actually. Testing the solidarity at regional level, EU member states scrambling over, you know, the so-called untied aid, the global political economy and global supply chains, the role of the informal labor sector, national responses being kind of trial and error without comprehensive and systematic impact assessment-based approach. So all valuable observations that you shared with us. It was particularly interesting to hear about, and you started with this, about self-employed and informal sector workers that do not have the luxury to be protected during times of crisis. So they're left to their own devices by our economy and by our society. You also mentioned frontline workers as being particularly vulnerable and highly exposed. And this leads me naturally to our next last, but definitely not least speaker, Stefan Plovert from the European Trade Union Confederation, who would talk more about the workers. As Katarina from the European Commission mentioned, currently social partners and trade unions are being consulted for the minimum wage regulation. So maybe Stefan can also mention about this as well. So Stefan, the word is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mila. Thank you, dear colleagues, for having invited me as well as last, but maybe indeed not as least. Well, what can I say about the challenges? Much has been said, and with all what has been said, I can agree. Because indeed, the challenges which we have been facing were manifold. And as has been said by several of us, unfortunately, they were not new. In a way, for us, when this whole thing started, we were witnessing in-house, I would say, the economic crisis 2008 2.0. It was the whole debate all over again, but with the additional problem, I would say, that now we were looking at the same rights being violated, so workers' rights and trade union rights in particular, but rights which had hardly been recuperated from the hit and the blows they got under the economic crisis, let alone from the different austerity measures that then were adopted. So we were even a further step backwards than where we are with the economic crisis. Now, indeed, as it has been said, this has all been aggravated, I would say, by the COVID-19 for different reasons. And that has put also challenges to us, in particular in organizing our work, because it is clear that this crisis was not only a social and economic crisis, it will be at the end, of course, but it locked down, it shut down complete societies, from the elderly till the young, from the disabled to everybody was in one way or the other hit. And that means that it was not only the social and economic rights which were directly attacked, but often it was also done via measures in relation to the traditional rights, human rights, the civil and political one. I refer to the many prohibitions of demonstrations, freedom of expression, etc., which automatically have an impact on society as a whole, but also trickle down to what can be done or not in the world of work and at the workplace. Another challenge which we faced, apart from the thematic ones, which are already mentioned by many of the speakers before, is the speed by which this was hitting us. And the speed by which it was hitting us was mainly, I would say, reflected also in the way measures were announced, adopted, introduced. We saw an enormous wave compared to 2008, an enormous wave of so-called emergency decrees, emergency rules, where often, very often, we did not have the possibility for different reasons to contest them. For different reasons, such as the institutions to which we have to address ourselves or can address ourselves were also in lockdown. They were struggling themselves in trying to get their work back together, being operational, etc. So that was an additional, I would say, rather procedural problem that we knew what the problems were, but how and who could we address in this short notice under this enormous political pressure. If I then see how new challenges or new topics nevertheless arise, I can only confirm that, of course, the problem of young, the problem of elderly is again an enormous problem. And for elderly, I might refer to the fact that at least in 2018, within the framework of the CDDH, so the Steering Committee of Human Rights, work has started on protection of elderly persons in all areas, I would say, of life, including work, but also care, etc. So we might look at that to see what we can pick up from that discussion and alleviate it to maybe some more binding rules. That's one thing. Secondly, which also emerged to us more in particular, was the whole discussion of health in general, but health and safety at work, which got a whole new dimension for the moment in our current work. And then something which is hardly touched upon by the other speakers is the whole issue of artificial intelligence and human rights. We are confronted with apps, tracing systems, whatever, with all due consequences for the right to dignity, the right to privacy, etc. And we are just not prepared yet for that, at least not in relation to legally binding instrument. There is, of course, linked to that the whole discussion on how to protect those who are in the new forms of work, the gig workers, the self-employed, the persons that even in normal telework who often do not have a proper protection. And maybe as last challenge that we had to face with was, of course, to reorganize our own work, given everything which was facing us, but also, as I said, how can we reach as quickly as possible the relevant institutions who were little by little also shut down. And this also had consequences, severe consequences, and that will show later on and in the future, which had severe consequences for the monitoring and the supervisory procedures in relation to the rights we want to protect. So I'll stop from there for the challenges and come back to you later on with some ideas on what new tools we might need. But I fully agree that most of the challenges are referred to, so we can further embark on that discussion later on if you want to.
Thank you very much, Stefan. We heard for the first time artificial intelligence mentioned so far, and Sandra was actually briefly touched upon NHRI and an equality body, namely the Human Institute for Human Rights, who, for example, were involved with the government in drafting ethical guidelines for controlling contact tracing application. So the process has been stalled due to the intervention also of the Dutch NHRI and equality body, and similar interventions offer a way forward, or at least a promising approach to address the challenges of artificial intelligence from a social rights perspective. And with this, we would move to the next question, which is namely that kind of gives us, goes in the forward-looking direction. What are the tools, approaches, instruments that we have at our disposal to ensure that recovery efforts at national, but also at regional level, are equality and human rights compliant? I would suggest that this time we go in the reverse order. So Stefan, would it be too stressful for you to take the word again, since you kind of touched upon the next step?
No problem, no problem. With pleasure, I would say. What is our vision of post-COVID Europe? How should it look like? And what do we need for that? I think for us, one thing is sure. Post-COVID-19 Europe will not be business as usual. It will not be a question of going back to the normal, because there is no normal anymore. Basically, what we need to do is build a new normal. That will take time, for sure. But I think the new normal must have one conditio sine qua non. If something that the economic crisis and now the COVID-19 crisis learned us is it cannot be a new normal without indeed strengthening and the protection of human rights, and that implies civil, political, but certainly also economic and social rights. But before we come to the human rights approach, I think we also need a shift in the approach of what this recovery could and should look like. the overall approach which we have now up till now, and which was also reflected in the famous European semester to which we already have referred to, is that it was recovery through austerity. Now, this failure we cannot afford to make again. The new approach has to be investment. Investment in structures, investment in actors, in fact, investment in people. If I say investment in structures, I refer, for instance, to the public service in general, but in particular, of course, the health sector now. If I refer to actors, I refer to the labor inspectors, I refer to national human rights institutes, ombudsman, but last, of course, and not least, social partners. Why? Because both those structures, as well as those actors, have been also amongst those who have been the hardest hit by the austerity measures after 2008. They often do not enough human and financial resources, so they have to be built up again, or at least strengthened. Why do I also, of course, focus on social partners and in particular trade unions, is because I also saw in the presentation of CoE-FRA, several articles mentioned, several organizations mentioned, but what was not mentioned, at least not explicitly, are social partners and in particular trade union rights. But we shouldn't forget that if you look to the map of Europe and where countries were able to be resilient, or the most resilient in relation to COVID-19 and COVID-19 measures to be taken, it was thanks to and or together with the social partners on every level, tripartite, bipartite, up till the enterprise level. Look at all the good, for instance, experiments and texts we have recently in relation to health and safety, return to work after COVID-19. So I think also those actors should not be forgotten. And then last but not least, the investment in people. I think we cannot afford, again, the austerity measures whereby last time we cut in benefits, we have cut in wages, etc. On the contrary, I think now it is a question of ensuring that everybody have fair and if possible even increased wages and income so that we can increase the demand side and the purchasing power in order to get our economy back on track. Now, what will this particularly mean in relation to human rights? As I said, basically, the approach in the recovery cannot be economic only, as it was last time. It has this time to be, for sure, a human rights-based approach. That, for me, also means in first phase that we need to get rid, as much as possible, of the different emergency measures that were adopted. Why? They are still there. They might not be used for the moment, but the frameworks are still there, and they might be in a sleeping mode for the moment and might have devastating effects later on when somebody finds out that they still exist and operate them again. Secondly, and I fully agree with what has been said by previous speakers, what we need urgently is human rights impact assessments. And this is not a new call, I know. I only refer to the reports which we have elaborated within, again, the Steering Committee for Human Rights, the CDDH, in particular the Social Rights Group, where we call for human rights impact assessments, in particular with a focus on social and economic rights. These assessments have to be done both on collective and individual social rights. But beyond, I would say, the focus on social and economic rights in the different initiatives, be them at European, be them at national level, we also have to look at the more general measures. Because unfortunately, if I give you the example of the European Union, we see more and more initiatives arising in recent times which deal with the rule of law, which deal with democracy, which deal with human rights in general. Now, if you look at those texts and all these initiatives, collective and individual social rights are either omitted or largely forgotten. I refer to the different initiatives in relation to the rule of law, to the action plan on human rights and democracy, to the European Democracy Plan, which is announced for the last quarter of 2020, and even the day before yesterday, we have the European Commission together with IDEA, launching a global COVID-19 monitor, but look at the rights that they will monitor, social rights are hardly covered, let alone trade union rights. So what we see is, unfortunately, a growing trend within the EU throughout its different initiatives, where it seems to be that they are likely to create, I would call, a new hierarchy of human rights, or maybe the old hierarchy of human rights with civil and political rights first, and then second-class social rights. This is not the way forward. What we need to do is indeed ensure that social rights are at the forefront in every initiative that is taken. And if I may give you one example now, very recently, you touched upon minimum wages and collective bargaining initiative of the European institutions. Well, if there is one reason why there are references, at least in the different documents of the Commission, on fair wages and to the European Social Charter, it's because the EQC hinted the EU institutions of the fact that there is something as a European Social Charter which guarantees a fair minimum wage. So next to the streaming of social rights and impact assessments, I think indeed, as Michael already referred to, we need enhanced multilateral and bilateral partnerships. And that brings me, of course, to the Council of Europe in first instance, because we are talking in this sphere, but I fully agree, Michael, with your remark in relation to supply chain and to go and think more global. That is also why we are supporting a legally binding UN treaty on this issue. But within the Council of Europe, I think there is, again, as I also said, quite a lot of scope for improvements. I'm very much appreciated the presentation of CoE-FRA. In relation to the European Social Charter. You listed several articles. It is indeed also my view that the Charter is well equipped as it stands for the moment in relation to the articles and the rights it protects and guarantees. What is not necessarily so if we talk about how to turn the Charter into a living instrument and the enforcement of the instrument. What do I mean with a living instrument? You referred indeed to the fact that there is this general statement or this statement, as well as a new one, a general one coming up, which is very much appreciated. But I already said last year in September at the high-level conference of social rights, the protection of social rights in Strasbourg, that there is a lot of scope to make sure that via the interpretation, amongst others, of the ECSR, but also in relation to the Convention of there is scope to make it more living and more adapted to the current challenges we are facing. One idea might be, because we have a quite still rigid monitoring system, is to make use more of what indeed the ECSR is doing now in relation to statement of interpretations, to be more on the spot, more up to date, to the point when a challenge arises, to come up with a statement of interpretation. That's one thing. You will find many other recommendations in, of course, the report of the CDDH-SAC, and they turn in relation to, in particular, enforcement. Also there is enormous scope for improving the situation, and I don't mean simplifying or making it less efficient. It was therefore a little bit also unfortunate that CoE-FRA mentioned Articles 7 and 8 to be relevant articles in this discussion, but it is very unfortunate that recently we got, it's still not final, but we got the decision of the governmental committee, in particular the Bureau of the Governmental Committee, that they are not able, so-called, to touch upon cases which deal with Article 7, paragraph 5, so young persons and wages or remuneration, as well as Article 8 in relation to protection of mothers, that they are not able to discuss the cases that were selected by the ECSR because we have a lack of time. I'm sorry, this is not a question of time. This is a question of protection of rights. So this is only one element of saying there is a need to enforce the mechanism procedures further. Then I think next to the existing one and exploiting the benefits of the existing one is that we need new instruments. I already referred to where we are in relation to artificial intelligence. I can name what Kim referred to, environment and human rights. I think it's areas where we urgently need to develop more legally binding instruments. And then of course, if we talk about multilateral, I think we also have to ensure that the Council of Europe instruments, as we try to do on a daily basis, are more serving as a benchmark throughout EU action. And of course, then we come to the discussion of the EU accession. I think this is urgently needed, not only in relation to the European Convention of Human Rights, but from my point of view and ECC points of view, of course, also to the European Social Charter. I will leave it to that with some ideas on where we can improve and the way forward, but I'm open to any questions you might have for me.
Thank you, Stefan. Insightful as usual. Just a quick retort to you by Aoife, if I may give the word to her very briefly.
I mean, it's not a retort, because I think fundamentally Stefan and I agree very strongly on most of the key issues. I think the one thing I would flag with the living instrument challenge and the expectation of statements of interpretation quickly. So I think it's interesting that we went with a statement of interpretation, which is effectively a soft law interpretation, whereas other international human rights bodies did something quicker, something more wide-ranging, and it was in the form of a press release. And I think that one of the challenges with the statement of interpretation is that it's an authoritative interpretation, right? It's not just a statement, and it has to have a certain amount of time. It has to be based to some degree on state practice. So while I don't disagree that it's needed, and we're working on it, there has to be to some degree a sense of where the land is going, where things are going to land before you respond, so that the statement of interpretation actually responds meaningfully, not just to the short-term crisis, but to the longer-term context. And we have more and more information on it, but we're already 2 months later in a very different position from what we were in say 20th of April when we did it. So absolutely taken on board. But what I would say is there's a danger to being too responsive if you're doing it through a statement of interpretation. But there may, for instance, be other ways, press releases, statements, other public outcomes that could be more responsive, and I absolutely take your point and would share your view on that. It's a discussion within the committee. I certainly wouldn't disagree with the role of trade unions. I think it's fundamental in the post-crisis context. I think there has been a challenge that needs to be acknowledged, a tension about the use of rights language by trade unions in some countries, an element of territoriality, and an element of concern about using rights that are quite often correctly criticized for being used to reinforce existing inequalities and power distributions. And certainly that's been a very extensive discussion in many European countries, as you know, around whether rights should be the founding focus, the main focus of trade unions. And by rights, I mean beyond trade union rights, of trade unions and social movements, for instance. I can't talk about the CCDH report because we'll be doing a formal response. Noted. I can assure you everyone on the committee has read that report and is very conscious. With regards to the governmental committee, we have the final say as to what the law is under the charter. It's under the Turin Protocol. I won't comment on what they've said, but obviously they're not dealing with the collective complaints. And finally, I just want to say though, I think what Stefan is saying, and it's so important about enforcement and making it a living instrument. But what we face with the Charter is ultimately, it's relegated within the Council of Europe. Social rights are relegated within European, law teaching, advocacy, etc. And that is an excuse not to do anything, but it does make clear there has to be shift at the domestic level as well. And the committee can lead or it can play a role, but actually it has to come from the ground up. So that's why, and this will sound really placatory or kind of everyone loves everybody, big hug, but actually that's why engagement is very important between the people who do the on the ground heavy lifting and the people who are, dealing with the complaints, doing the kind of, supranational monitoring, as it were, if you want to think of the committee that way. So what I would say is I think it's hugely important, and there's no point, the committee could be fantastic, but unless there's serious advances at the domestic level in many European countries with regards to the use of social rights language, advocacy, putting pressure on government, getting it into policy language, we can do everything, we can do what we want, but we're not going to change the scene enough to really make sure that social rights have proper bite, in future crises contexts, because they haven't so far. So it's a case of trying to work in partnership and mutually supporting, but acknowledging that a part-time committee that is currently, doing everything online, it was never going to be able to do the heavy lifting. So we have to think more effectively and strategically, both the committee and our partners, about how to push forward social rights. So not disagreeing with you, but I suppose just giving a slightly different perspective on it. But I think those are really valuable comments. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Aoife. Tanya, would just wanted to say something in response. I take it to what you, Aoife, said. No?
Yeah, thank you, Mila. I just found, as always, Stefan's intervention extremely interesting, and following what Aoife just said, I would like to add that the committee had only in June, I think, two statements done through the president in two different meetings. One of them was a high-level video conference organized by the Greek chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers, and another exchange was held with between the Secretary General of the Council of Europe and the presidents of monitoring bodies, where the president of the European Committee of Social Rights participated, and where in many occasions he stressed the importance that pandemic or not, the social rights and human rights in general have to be respected. And if we had respected them before, probably we would have had less problems today. He also talked in many occasions about the responsibility of the Committee of Ministers in enforcing the social charter and its provisions in member states. And he also called again the Committee of Ministers to consider the accession of the EU to the European Social Charter. So there have been many interventions lately. It's not just a statement of interpretation. And we've been waiting for the Greek chairmanship to issue a final statement after this high-level conference on the impact of the pandemic on social rights. So this is on what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Tanya. This was helpful in clarifying when a statement would come out. And then I would give the word back to our remaining two panelists, namely Michael and Gregorios, with a kind request, if possible, to keep their interventions as short as possible, since in the concluding section, they can also touch upon ways forward and promising approaches and tools for promoting recovery efforts that protect and strengthen equality and human rights. Thank you. Maybe Michael, you can go first.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And it has started to rain here in between in my campsite, so I'm still not swept away. Let me start by saying it's a huge amount of money which is used. And if you just fill it back into old, let's say, recipes, we will not have solutions which we need. Yeah, this is true either for the Green Deal, that it really becomes not just growth, because growth will not help us in the long run only. It needs to be sustainable growth, that's definitely. And secondly, we have to see under the burn glass, what are the loopholes we had in the social protection systems in the beforehand, yeah, and to address them more properly. Otherwise, we would not find adequate answers. We talked about this human rights impact assessment, and the question is, first, how should it be done and who should do it? Let me start by the question, who should do it? Yeah, normally it could be either the office of the president or the chancellery in Germany, which would be the ideal place to coordinate these type of policy responses. Or even better, it could be at least echoed or maybe also done by parliamentary committees relating to these areas. Yeah, so we have a parliamentary committee working on technology assessment, which should make an assessment of new technologies and how they will have impacts on these and that. So why we don't have a committee doing human rights impact assessments, at least in this type of scope of answers. So we need to think institutionally about how to get something set up which really is hard to, yeah, and not just done by some academics. Yeah, if we do it alone in our national human rights institution, nobody will follow us. It needs to have a societal strength. Yeah, I think that is very important. So either the executive or the legislative branch, or maybe both would be a good place to do this so systematically. So what to monitor, how to do it? We heard already from IFU that you have these guiding principles for economic policies, for human rights impact assessment, which can be used definitely, but I would also refer to maybe the statement our committee did, the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, on the 6th of April on economic, social, cultural rights and COVID. And we were just sticking to some normal routines, how we interpret or use these rights. Yeah? And maybe we have just to ask for a more elaborated recognition of what has developed, of understanding of economic, social, cultural rights, instead of always saying we are at the back. So much has been developed, it can just be used, yeah, by parliaments, it can just be used by executive branches. And for example, we were just going back to start with an analysis of the most disadvantaged and marginalized groups in this statement. Yeah, what is the particularly problems they have? Look at the health sector. Look at forms of discrimination, particularly gender discrimination or other groups which might be particularly eligible to discrimination, refugee, asylum seekers, and so forth. Or look at forms of intersectional discrimination. These are the first steps you need. Then you have to look at your budget. Yeah, check the resources available. Yeah, and these are on expenditures and an income. You can also think about how to increase the income for certain things. It's not forbidden to think about this. Yeah, and as long as we allow so many tax havens to happen inside the European Union or inside the companies, yeah. Or if you look who is gaining most from the COVID response is companies which are basically having all their incomes generated, Amazon and others, in the tax havens. What can be the response to this? Yeah, we have to think about these things. Otherwise, we will not have enough maximum available resources. So these, I think, the elements are not so hidden. We can formulate what should be done in a human rights impact assessment. Yeah. The next thing is the impact assessment needs to be participatory. We need to get the actors involved, which are maybe victims or beneficiaries of such a policy. Yeah? So that needs social welfare institutions, NGOs, social movements, particularly trade unions or the social partners, as Stefan was saying. They needs to be part of this impact assessment. It cannot just be an executive one. It needs to be participatory, and that is extremely important. Let me add one last thought. The human rights institutions itself, or the equality bodies, we ourselves needs to be more secure how to do a human rights impact assessment. We have to educate ourselves properly so that we are faster in giving advice to parliamentary committees, to executive branches. In doing so, this is really needed, and we have to be fast in developing our own skills in that area. We have neglected economic, social, cultural rights also on our sides for a long period, yeah, and it needs to be overcome. And at the end, what are the instruments we would like to need? And maybe in the last round, we can speak about the Convention on Rights of Elderly, which we are really in favor of. But just to mention, at the European level, we can talk about a binding law on business and human rights, for example. There are many other things which could be mentioned. I just want not to proliferate a lot of, let's say, instruments at that moment, but it needs to be carefully thought through. What are chances which we have, and the binding instrument for business and human rights at least would be one which would be available quite soon if there is enough political will at the European level. Yeah, maybe the rest I reserve for the last round. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. No transition and comments on my part this time. Directly giving the word to Grigoris, if possible. Time is advancing. We have 20 minutes left. So maybe my colleagues can be creative and suggest innovative ways to combine closing and Q&A session comments. Thank you very much. Grigoris, up to you.
Okay, try to be brief. So I agree with many comments that were made until now. Well, the vision is to have a more green, digital and social Europe. Well, this is the big, let's say, picture, but what does this mean practically? We need to be practical. First of all, we need to tackle all the challenges identified before during the session that we had. Education, health, employment are very important issues. But the big challenge in the end, since as FA has raised, is the marginalization of social rights and of, I would say, also of human rights when it comes to talking about economic policies, is to the big challenge is how to deal with this marginalization, to find solutions, and to get out of this marginalization. And the answer to this is to be active, participating, and be part of the consultation. Sirpa, I think, also raised it in one of your comments. We need people, we need different actors to participate actively in the design of policies, in the implementation of policies, in the monitoring of policies. So this is the one thing. Of course, second issue is that you need money for all kinds of policies. To keep it at the EU level, now the discussion is about the proposal by the Commission is for an overall package of 2.4 trillion euros. So this is the more ambitious package that we had until now. Well, we have to wait and see what will come out of this discussion. Unfortunately, yeah, we will not know until autumn, and I'm not so sure that this is the right way to go. I mean, wait until autumn, but I don't know if there is much to do there. So, but let's take the positive aspect is that we have this proposal right now, and if we come with a decision close to that proposal, the question will be, okay, and now how we spend this money. And here I think that the vision that has also to do with how to demarginalize social rights and human rights is how to involve actors, especially NHRIs and equality bodies, in the disbursement of these amounts. And all of you know that there is this proposal to link the new MFF and the new funds to the charter, the EU charter conditionality. I refer now to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And this charter contains a whole list of rights that are not only civil or political, they are also social rights. So we do have an instrument at the EU level. And now this proposal to include a charter conditionality for the disbursement of EU funds is accompanied by another proposal to involve NHRIs, equality bodies, and civil society, trade unions in the monitoring, the design and the monitoring of the programs that will be funded by the EU funds. I know that many NHRIs and equality bodies may be a bit reluctant with the idea of being involved for many different reasons. We can discuss about this. But still, I think that this is a big opportunity to achieve the main target, which is to put in the heart of the discussion about the recovery and economic development, or whatever we can call it, in the heart of this to put in NHRIs and human rights and social rights in the heart of this discussion. So I will keep it there for the moment. Maybe we will have a chance to say a bit more, a few more things later. Thanks.
Thank you, Grigorios. Fascinating. EU Charter conditionality. If they also mainstream Charter monitoring, well, different principles of the Charter in the European semester, this will be a ambitious way forward. I would now give the word to my co-moderator, and my digital online aide, Nina, who has collected questions from different participants. I also am aware that one participant would probably speak up and she would address the question personally. So maybe first, Nina.
Hello, thank you very much to everybody. I think, yeah, it's some of the participants who were also asking questions, you have seen it in the chat, have already left. But I will just, turn your attention to the first question that we actually received from Alison from the Scottish Human Rights Commission who was actually reacting to the presentation of Kim, who also has left for the train. And she was actually asking all together, like, how do we actually encourage governments to take a human rights-based approach to economic recovery, given, of course, that all the challenges that we have, which was also discussed here. Sirpa, who also left us, who is the director of the Finnish Human Rights Institute, she had a specific question for Michael, and she was interested to know, like, how what models for a human rights impact assessment we have, because she was comparing the situation as you explained it in Germany, that it was also the case in Finland. And then we also have a question from Emily, and I don't know, I'm asking Emily if there is a problem with her microphone, or if she is happy to read it out. And I'm looking and searching for her, because Emily, yes, allowed to talk. Yeah, are you able? If not, just write me and I'm happy to read it out for you. Okay, so I think for the time being, I will just yeah, she had a very specific question for any of you, and it was partially answered by Michael. Do you see any role of NHRIs and equality bodies ensuring that the most vulnerable countries do not support this, do not suffer, I believe, yeah, disproportionately on the cost of the economic and social rights? Do you think enhanced cooperation between actually NHRIs and different and equality bodies from different countries could be a solution? So I hope that I address this question right, Emily. And I think, I mean, with your, of course, allowance, Mila, I think maybe you can pick and choose which question you would like to answer, and then also include your concluding remarks if you can in responding the question. And I mean, just please let me know if you want to have them repeated. Thank you.
I see that Emily from the Belgian equality body UNIA is now writing that due to technical problems she cannot join us, but indeed this is her question. So the way, yeah, did you want me to repeat it? I'm addressing the panelists now. Would this be helpful? Would anyone like to respond to this question? This is the question of, I guess, Europe on well, if it's about Europe, of course, Europe on two speeds. So NHRIs and equality bodies ensure that the most vulnerable countries do not support disproportionately the costs of the crisis in terms of economic and social rights. Do you think that enhanced cooperation at the level of, so between national human rights institutions and equality bodies from different countries could help tackle this challenge? Indeed, Michael did talk about, you know, conditionalities. I guess you were referring to the grants versus loans debate and the modalities and conditionalities that accompany aid packages from the EU to member states. Nobody interested in answering this question, I take it? No?
Yeah, I can say something to this. I first think we have a responsibility as National Human Rights Institution also to see possible negative impact extraterritorial, not only at our national territories. So if German companies, let's use, because I'm a German, or European companies are causing these problems as I have described in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ethiopia, we have a response also on our own, yeah, on these companies. It's not just an issue of the National Human Rights Institution of Bangladesh. It's also our own role, which we have to look at, yeah. And I think in that sense, we also have to make sure that if there is soon some vaccination available, maybe for COVID, that there are not some trade rules or intellectual property rights which hinder poorer countries to have access to essential medicines. So these are things we are co-influential when we have extraterritorial obligations to take them serious. Yeah, and I think that is important to see. But equally, or vice versa, it's extremely helpful that we collaborate with national human rights institutions from these parts of the world, also to understand maybe their problems, yeah, and to get a first-hand assessment of the problems, yeah, and maybe where we can together get some support. Yeah, it can be donor-related policies, yeah, that the European Union policies or World Bank aid or others are not having the wrong conditionalities, as it was in austerity times very often the case, hindering states to develop a good welfare state because certain policies were forbidden. It was only open for maybe certain private investment, let's say policy space to be developed in terms of trade policy, in letting in food imports coming in and other things. So these type of exchanges urgently needed, yeah, and we have to find the space also among us between European national human rights institutions from East and West Europe, North and South, but also at the global level to exchange on these things. And I think that is urgently needed. I fully agree with this. Yeah? So we need our own capacity for good human rights assessments to be improved, but we need also to become much better in our monitoring capacities, yeah, to do the assessments needed. Both is really at stake, and we have to fast develop in these aspects, as we can see, because then we are of more help and duty also for states and parliaments looking for good answers to the problems which are there, because they are not all by nature easily to find properly. Yeah? So that would be my response.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. This was a thought-provoking question, so thank you for tackling that one. I didn't hear any responses to Alison's question from the Scottish Human Rights Commission. It was a question, Nina, correct me please if I'm wrong, about, in general, about using a human rights approach to economic reforms. It wasn't addressed to a specific speaker. It was a general question from what I remember from the chat history. So would anyone like to take up this one? I know several of you, including Stefan, Michael, and Aoife, referred specifically to human rights assessments. Maybe something that you would like to add, or a caveat that you would like to make?
No, maybe Stefan here. No, I don't think I have something to add. Indeed, in different interventions of Aoife and myself, but also Michael referred to the need for human rights impact assessments on every level, with, I would say, in particular now, a focus on social rights yeah, social rights in particular. So we can only stress that, but I also think that the point you have made, Mila, not only to do that at a European level in relation to law and national level in relation to law, we should also do it in policy measures as such. And for the EU, then I particularly agree with your reference to the fact of using at least the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, but by preference, from our point of view, the European Social Charter as a benchmark or an assessment tool in relation to the European semester, because it is true, as it has been said, that in recent years, the number of social CSRs have increased. My personal analysis of that was, is it a kind of payback time, in a sense that if you look at the first social CSRs in the first years, they were numerous, but they all ran in the wrong direction. Employment protection legislation that had to be flexibilized, collective bargaining systems, wages had to decrease, benefits had to decrease, so it was a kind of payback time. And, as you know, and some of you know, I have made annual analysis of the social CSRs. I have now left that work to my colleague at EQI, and surprisingly, there is an increasing number of total CSRs this year. But if you compare that now to the number of social CSRs, or what we consider social CSRs, there is an enormous decrease of social CSRs. So, and then on top of it, with a particular focus, a right focus because of COVID-19, for instance, on short working time schemes, telework, etc., etc. So we need to be careful, but what we are really missing, advocating that for a long time already, is what you said, that there need to be an economic and in particular social rights assessment in the semester as well. By preference using the Charter of the Council of Europe, and if this is not possible, at least the solidarity chapter of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Thank you very much, Stefan.